Some families keep secrets behind closed doors. Whispered conversations that stop when someone enters the room. Locked bedrooms and hushed phone calls. But what happens when those secrets aren't just embarrassing family drama or financial troubles? What happens when the darkness growing in your own home is so twisted, so unthinkable, that even when you discover it, no one will believe you? This is the story of Sharon Fields, a mother who tried to save her family from a horror she never saw coming. It started with a hospital stay that revealed cracks in what seemed like a perfect marriage. It escalated through a disturbing family secret that...
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
It shattered everything she thought she knew about the people she loved most. And it ended with a daughter found cold, bruised, and barely recognizable in her own bedroom. But here's the part that makes this case unforgettable. Her son wasn't just on the run. He was sitting in that church pew for another reason entirely. One that would have shattered more innocent lives if she hadn't walked through those sanctuary doors with justice in her hands. This isn't just another story about a family falling apart. This is what happens when evil grows under your own roof, when the people you trust most become the very ones you should fear, and when a mother's love transforms into something far more dangerous than anyone could imagine. In the crisp autumn of 2020, Sharon Fields collapsed during her shift at Crawford Elementary School in DeKalb County, Georgia. The 47-year-old administrative assistant had been feeling run down for weeks, but she attributed it to the stress of managing 3 different after-school programs and the endless paperwork that seemed to multiply overnight. When she hit the floor in the main office that Tuesday afternoon, her colleagues initially thought she had simply fainted from overwork. But the ambulance ride to Grady Memorial Hospital revealed something far more serious. Doctors discovered that what Sharon had dismissed as a stubborn cold was actually severe pneumonia complicated by chronic fatigue syndrome. Her immune system was so compromised that her body had been slowly shutting down for months. The medical team made it clear she wouldn't be going home anytime soon. What followed were nearly 3 months of intensive treatment, oxygen therapy, and careful monitoring as her body fought to recover from what could have been a fatal condition. During those long weeks in the hospital, Sharon began to notice something that troubled her more than her own failing health. Her husband Charles, who had been her devoted partner for 22 years, visited less and less frequently. When he did show up, he seemed distracted, checking his phone constantly and making excuses to leave early. Their 19-year-old son Derek was even more absent, claiming work conflicts or prior commitments that always seemed to conveniently arise during visiting hours. But her 21-year-old daughter Tiana was different. She showed up every single day after her shifts at the downtown Atlanta restaurant where she worked as a server. She brought her mother's favorite magazines, asked detailed questions about the treatment plan, and stayed until the nurses practically had to escort her out at the end of visiting hours. She was the lifeline that kept Sharon anchored during the darkest period of her recovery. When Sharon was finally discharged in late January 2021, she expected to return to the warm, chaotic household she remembered. The family movie nights on Friday evenings, Charles leaving sweet notes on her coffee mug before heading to his job at the logistics company, Derek's loud music spilling from his bedroom, and Tiana's constant chatter about her dreams of opening her own catering business someday. Instead, she walked into a house that felt like a museum, clean, organized, and completely devoid of the energy that had once made it feel like home. Charles greeted her with a brief hug and immediately busied himself with unpacking her hospital bag. He had prepared a welcome home dinner, but he ate in silence, responding to her questions about his work and what had happened during her absence with vague, one-word answers. Derek emerged from his room long enough to mumble a greeting before disappearing again, claiming he had plans with friends. The only person who seemed genuinely happy to have her home was Tiana, who had taken time off work to help her mother settle back into her routine. Over the following weeks, Sharon tried to convince herself that the strange atmosphere was temporary. Charles was probably dealing with the stress of managing the household alone for 3 months. Derek was at that age where young men naturally pull away from their families. But Tiana saw what her mother was trying to ignore. The man who used to leave love notes and surprise Sharon with her favorite flowers wasn't just distant. He was actively avoiding her. He spent hours in the garage after work, claiming to organize tools or work on projects that never seemed to produce any visible results. He stopped asking about her recovery, stopped initiating conversations, and seemed almost relieved when she went to bed early, still exhausted from her illness. Derek's behavior was even more concerning. He had always been moody, but now he seemed almost hostile toward his mother. When Sharon tried to engage him in conversation, he would look right through her, as if she weren't speaking. He started staying out all night without explanation, returning home only to shower and change clothes before leaving again. The few times Sharon attempted to establish some ground rules about communication and respect, he would walk away mid-sentence, leaving her standing alone in whatever room she had tried to corner him in. 5 weeks after Sharon's return home, everything changed in a single moment that would haunt Tiana for the rest of her life. She had picked up an extra shift at the restaurant, but was sent home early when the evening crowd never materialized. She pulled into the driveway around 8:30, noticing that her mother's bedroom light was off. Sharon had been going to bed earlier as part of her recovery routine. The house was quiet, and she assumed Charles was in the garage working on whatever project had been consuming his evenings lately. She walked through the kitchen, grabbed a bottle of water from the refrigerator, and headed toward the garage to ask her father if he wanted her to make him a late dinner. She had done this dozens of times before, but when she opened the door that connected the kitchen to the garage, her world exploded into pieces that would never fit back together again. Charles and Derek weren't working on any project. They were locked in an intimate embrace that was so explicit, so undeniably sexual, that Tiana's brain initially refused to process what she was seeing. Her father's hands were tangled in her brother's hair. Derek was pressed against the workbench, and both men were partially undressed. There was no mistaking what was happening, no innocent explanation that could make sense of the scene playing out in front of her. She didn't scream. She didn't say a word. She simply backed out of the doorway, closed the door as quietly as possible, and ran to her bedroom, where she locked the door and collapsed on her bed in tears. The image burned itself into her memory with such clarity that she knew she would never be able to forget it. Her father and brother, the two men she had grown up loving and trusting, engaged in something so wrong, so impossible to comprehend, that she spent the entire night crying and vomiting. For 3 days, Tiana couldn't bring herself to tell anyone what she had witnessed. She called in sick to work, barely ate, and avoided both Charles and Derek completely. When they were in the kitchen, she stayed in her room. When they were watching television, she found reasons to be anywhere else in the house. Sharon, still recovering and focused on regaining her strength, assumed her daughter was just overwhelmed by the stress of the past few months. Finally, on a quiet Saturday morning, while Charles was at work and Derek was still asleep, Tiana sat her mother down at the kitchen table and told her everything. She didn't sugarcoat it or try to soften the blow. She described exactly what she...
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
He had seen in detail, leaving no room for misinterpretation or denial. Sharon listened in complete silence, her face growing paler with each word until she looked like she might faint again. When Tiana finished speaking, Sharon stood up from the table without saying a word. She walked to her bedroom, closed the door, and didn't emerge for the rest of the day. That evening, when Derek returned home from wherever he had been spending his time, Sharon was waiting for him in the garage. Charles was working late, so it was just mother and son in the space where her family had been destroyed. The confrontation was brief but devastating. Sharon demanded to know if what Tiana had told her was true. She begged Derek to explain how this had started, how long it had been going on, and whether he understood how sick and wrong it was. She offered to help him find counseling, to support him in getting away from whatever hold Charles had over him, to do anything necessary to fix what had been broken in their family. Derek's response was worse than Sharon could have imagined. He didn't deny what Tiana had seen. He didn't apologize or show any sign of remorse. Instead, he looked his mother directly in the eyes and told her it was none of her business what he did with his life. When she pressed him further, explaining that this wasn't just about his choices, but about the destruction of their entire family, he spat directly in her face and walked away without another word. Sharon stood in the garage for nearly an hour after Derek left, trying to process what had just happened. The son she had carried for 9 months, nursed through countless illnesses, and defended against every criticism from teachers and neighbors, had just treated her with more disrespect than she would expect from a stranger on the street. When she finally went back into the house, she found Tiana waiting in the living room with tears streaming down her face. She had heard everything through the thin walls. From that moment forward, the Fields household became a war zone disguised as a home. Sharon and Tiana barely spoke to Charles and Derek. Meals were eaten in shifts to avoid having to sit at the same table. Conversations were limited to practical matters like grocery lists and utility bills. Charles seemed to sense that something had fundamentally changed, but he avoided any direct confrontation, choosing instead to spend even more time away from the house. Derek became openly hostile, playing music loudly at all hours, leaving messes throughout the common areas, and treating both women as if they were unwelcome guests in his home. The breaking point came in early February. Sharon had spent weeks agonizing over what to do with the information that had shattered her world. She couldn't continue living in the same house with two people who had no respect for basic human decency or family boundaries. She couldn't pretend that therapy or prayer or time would somehow fix what was fundamentally broken beyond repair. So she did the only thing that made sense. She filed for divorce. The legal process moved quickly once Sharon made her decision. She didn't want counseling sessions or mediation. She didn't want to split assets or negotiate custody arrangements. She just wanted out, and she wanted to take Tiana with her. By the end of February, she had found a small 2-bedroom apartment in Decatur and moved out of the house she had called home for over 15 years. Charles wasted no time controlling the narrative once Sharon was gone. To anyone who asked about the sudden divorce, he painted himself as the victim of a wife who had changed during her hospital stay. He claimed Sharon had become involved with someone else and had abandoned her family for a new relationship. He attended church regularly, took on additional volunteer responsibilities, and played the role of the heartbroken husband who was trying to hold his family together despite his wife's betrayal. Derek supported his father's version of events completely. To the few friends who asked about his mother's sudden departure, he described Sharon as unstable and disrespectful, claiming she had been verbally abusive toward Charles for months before finally leaving. The church community, unaware of the true reason for the divorce, rallied around Charles and Derek, viewing them as victims of a woman who had lost her way. Meanwhile, Sharon began the slow process of rebuilding her life in the small apartment she shared with Tiana. She found part-time work at a medical clinic, focusing on regaining her physical strength and trying to heal from the emotional devastation of losing her family. Tiana was furious about the lies being told about her mother, but Sharon refused to expose the truth. She believed the Real story was too sick, too shameful, and potentially too dangerous to share with people who wouldn't understand the complexity of what they had discovered. For several months, Sharon and Tiana lived quietly in their new home, trying to move forward from the nightmare they had left behind. Sharon began spending time with Dr. Vincent Cole, the physician who had overseen her recovery at Grady Memorial. He had reached out to check on her progress months earlier, and their professional relationship had gradually developed into something more personal. Vincent was a divorced father whose own children were grown and independent, and he was drawn to Sharon's quiet strength and determination to rebuild her life after such devastating circumstances. While Sharon was slowly healing and finding reasons to hope again, the situation back at her former home was deteriorating rapidly. Charles had been feeling increasingly fatigued and unwell, symptoms he initially attributed to the stress of the divorce and the challenge of managing the household alone. But when a routine physical examination revealed some concerning test results, he was advised to undergo additional screening that would change everything. The diagnosis was devastating. Charles had tested positive for HIV. The news sent him into a panic as he realized there was only one possible source of the infection. He had not been with any women since his marriage to Sharon, and Sharon had been tested extensively during her hospital stay with no positive results. The only intimate contact he had maintained was with Derek, which meant his own son had brought this life-threatening disease into their home. When Charles confronted Derek with the test results, demanding that his son also get tested, the response confirmed his worst fears. Derek's test also came back positive. The revelation that his son had not only engaged in their inappropriate relationship, but had also exposed him to a potentially fatal illness sent Charles into a rage that he had never experienced before. On the evening Derek returned from receiving his own test results, Charles was waiting at the front door with a loaded handgun. According to what investigators would later piece together from witness statements and evidence, Charles accused Derek of betraying him and bringing something into their home that would destroy what remained of their lives. Derek, seeing the weapon and recognizing the genuine threat, didn't wait to argue or explain. He ran from the house as fast as he could, ducking behind parked cars and cutting through neighbors' yards until he reached the main road. Charles never fired the weapon, but the threat was real enough to ensure that Derek would never feel safe returning home. Over the next several days, Derek stayed with various friends, moving from couch to couch as he tried to figure out what to do next. But once word spread about his HIV status, the invitations dried up quickly. No one wanted to take the risk of housing someone with his condition, and Derek found himself with nowhere to go and no one willing to help him. Desperate and running out of options, Derek began reaching out to the only family he had left. He sent text messages to Tiana, pleading with her to at least pass along messages to their mother. At first, Tiana ignored him completely. But when Derek started calling and leaving voicemails that revealed he was sleeping in parks and begging for food, she finally told Sharon what was happening. Sharon's initial response was firm and unforgiving. Derek had made his choices, had shown complete disrespect for her and their family, and had participated in creating the nightmare that had destroyed their home. But as the calls continued and Derek's situation became more desperate, something in Sharon began to soften. Despite everything he had done, he was still her son, and the thought of him homeless and starving was more than she could bear. After several days of internal struggle, Sharon made a decision that would prove to be fatal. She agreed to let Derek stay in their apartment temporarily, 1 week maximum, while he figured out a more permanent solution. When he arrived with nothing but a small duffel bag, he looked like a different person. He had lost weight, his clothes were dirty, and he couldn't make eye contact with either his mother or sister. The arrangement was tense from the beginning. Derek slept on an air mattress in the living room and barely spoke to anyone. Tiana refused to acknowledge his presence, leaving rooms when he entered and communicating only with their mother. Sharon tried to maintain some normalcy, but the apartment felt suffocating with all three of them trying to coexist in such a small space. Around this time, Sharon's relationship with Dr. Vincent Cole was becoming more serious. She had begun spending nights at his home, finding peace and comfort in his quiet, stable presence after months of chaos and trauma. Vincent lived alone in a spacious house across town, and being there allowed Sharon to feel like a normal person again, free from the constant tension that filled her apartment whenever Derek was around. These overnight stays left Tiana and Derek alone together in the apartment, a situation that made Tiana deeply uncomfortable, but seemed unavoidable given the circumstances. She had been working 2 jobs for months, morning shifts at a grocery store and evening shifts at a diner, saving every penny she could toward eventually getting her own place. Her savings were kept in cash, hidden in a metal lockbox tucked deep in her bedroom closet beneath folded sheets and old shoe boxes. She had nearly $4,000 saved, money that represented her ticket to independence and freedom from the family drama that had consumed her life. What Tiana didn't know was that Derek had discovered her hiding place. Whether he had been deliberately searching her room or had stumbled across it accidentally, he had found the lockbox and knew exactly how much money she had been saving. On a night when Sharon was at Vincent's house and Tiana was working a late shift at the diner, Derek broke into his sister's room and stole everything. When Tiana discovered the theft several days later, she was devastated. Months of careful saving, of working double shifts and skipping meals to put money aside, had been wiped out in a single night. She confronted Derek immediately, demanding that he return her money and explain how he could steal from the one person who had been willing to work with their mother to give him shelter when no one else would help him. Derek's response was to deny everything. He claimed he had no idea what she was talking about, suggested that she had probably misplaced the money or forgotten where she had put it, and acted offended that she would accuse him of theft. But Tiana wasn't fooled. She knew exactly where her money had been, and she knew.
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
Derek was the only person who could have taken it. What happened next would be reconstructed later through physical evidence, medical examination, and most disturbingly, video footage that Derek had recorded himself. On a Thursday evening, when Sharon was spending the night at Vincent's house, Tiana confronted Derek one final time about her stolen savings. The argument began in the living room, but moved to her bedroom when she went to show him the empty lockbox where her money had been hidden. Derek followed her into the room, and what started as a heated argument quickly escalated into something far more sinister. He overpowered his sister, tearing her clothes and sexually assaulting her while she screamed and fought to get away. When she tried to escape, he threw her against the wall and struck her repeatedly in the head. At one point, the back of her head hit the corner of the dresser with enough force to cause severe trauma. The attack continued for more than 20 minutes, during which Tiana's resistance gradually faded as the injuries to her head became more severe. By the time Derek's assault escalated to its most brutal phase, she was barely conscious and unable to defend herself. She never recovered from the attack, dying alone in her bedroom while her brother gathered his belongings and disappeared into the night. When Sharon returned home 2 days later, she was greeted by a smell that immediately told her something was terribly wrong. She found Tiana's body in the bedroom, partially covered by a sheet, clearly deceased for more than 24 hours. Derek was gone. His air mattress had been deflated and put away. His duffel bag was missing, and there was no sign that he had ever been there except for the horrific evidence of what he had done to his sister. The police investigation moved quickly once Tiana's body was discovered. Derek became the primary suspect immediately, and a manhunt was launched within hours. But despite extensive searches, surveillance footage reviews, and attempts to track his phone and financial activity, Derek seemed to have vanished completely. There were no digital footprints, no ATM transactions, no contact with known associates. It was as if he had simply disappeared off the face of the earth. Sharon fell into a state of shock that lasted for weeks. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, and could barely speak coherently about what had happened. Vincent became her primary support system, helping her navigate the police interviews, funeral arrangements, and media attention that surrounded Tiana's murder. The question that haunted everyone, investigators, friends, and Sharon herself, was how someone could commit such a brutal crime and then vanish without leaving any trace of where he might have gone. The answer came 3 weeks later in the form of a phone call that would set in motion the final chapter of this devastating story. Vincent was finishing up a shift at the hospital when his phone rang. The caller was an old friend from medical school who now worked as a volunteer sound technician at a large church in Fulton County. The friend had been following the news coverage of Tiana's murder and recognized Derek's face from the wanted posters that had been circulated throughout the Atlanta area. "I swear I just saw that guy they're looking for," the friend told Vincent. "Your girlfriend's son. He's sitting in our sanctuary right now, 3rd row from the front. The service is still going on, but I wanted to call you immediately." Vincent didn't hesitate. He called Sharon and told her exactly what his friend had reported. Sharon didn't ask questions or demand more details. She simply walked into her bedroom, opened the drawer where she kept the small handgun she had legally purchased for protection after Tiana's murder, and put it in her purse. The church was only 15 minutes away, and Sharon arrived while the service was still in progress. She parked 2 blocks away and walked to the sanctuary, slipping in through a side entrance while the pastor was delivering his message. The choir was seated, the ushers were at their positions, and everything looked completely normal except for one thing. There in the 3rd row from the front, wearing a black hoodie and jeans, was Derek Fields. Sharon took a seat 2 rows behind her son, close enough to be absolutely certain it was him, but far enough away to avoid being noticed. She waited quietly as the pastor finished his sermon and invited the congregation to prayer. As people began to bow their heads and close their eyes, Sharon stood up, removed the handgun from her purse, and called out Derek's name loud enough for everyone in the sanctuary to hear. When Derek turned around and saw his mother standing behind him with a weapon in her hand, he had less than 2 seconds to process what was happening before Sharon fired twice. Both shots found their target, and Derek collapsed in the pew where he had been sitting. The sanctuary erupted in chaos as people screamed and dove for cover, but Sharon remained calm and still, the gun hanging at her side as she waited for police to arrive. Sharon Fields was arrested within minutes of the shooting and was charged with murder in the 1st degree. She was held without bond and refused to give any statement to investigators or media beyond confirming her identity. When her attorney asked if she regretted her actions, she reportedly responded with 4 words: "There was no choice." In the days following Derek's death, investigators made a discovery that would change how everyone viewed Sharon's actions in that church. Among Derek's belongings, they found a small notebook filled with erratic writing, and most importantly, a list of names. One of those names belonged to a young woman who sang in the church choir, the same choir that had been performing when Sharon walked into the sanctuary that Sunday morning. The woman's name had been circled multiple times in Derek's notebook, with disturbing words written beside it that suggested he believed she was responsible for his HIV infection. Police interviews with the woman revealed that she had indeed encountered Derek at a party months earlier, but she had no knowledge of his HIV status and had certainly not infected him intentionally. What became clear to investigators was that Derek had not returned to church seeking redemption or forgiveness. He had been stalking his next victim. Given Derek's history of violence and sexual assault, and the fact that he had been carrying a weapon when he was killed, police concluded that Sharon had likely prevented another brutal attack. The young woman in the choir, unaware that she was being stalked, had been singing just feet away from someone who blamed her for his condition and may have been planning to harm her. Charles Fields, meanwhile, remained in the house he had once shared with his family, dealing with his HIV diagnosis and the complete collapse of his public reputation. Once the truth about his relationship with Derek became known through the police investigation, the church community that had once supported him turned away completely. He lost his job, his social connections, and any remaining respect in the community where he had lived for decades. Tiana Fields was buried in a private ceremony attended by a small group of extended family members and co-workers who remembered her as a hard-working young woman with dreams of starting her own business. Sharon, awaiting trial, was not permitted to attend her daughter's funeral, but Vincent Cole spoke on her behalf, delivering a brief eulogy that focused on Tiana's determination to build a better life for herself despite the chaos that had consumed her family. The case against Sharon Fields never went to trial. After reviewing all the evidence, including the notebook found in Derek's possession, his history of violence, and the circumstances surrounding his presence in the church, prosecutors offered Sharon a plea agreement for voluntary manslaughter with a reduced sentence. Her attorney advised her to accept the deal, explaining that a jury might be sympathetic to her situation, but that the law still required consequences for taking another person's life, even under such extreme circumstances. Sharon served 18 months in a minimum security facility before being released on parole. She returned to live quietly with Vincent Cole, who had waited for her throughout her incarceration. They eventually married in a small private ceremony, and Sharon found work at a different medical clinic where her past was not widely known. She rarely spoke about the events that had destroyed her family, choosing instead to focus on building a peaceful life with the man who had stood by her through the worst period of her existence. The story of the Fields family serves as a chilling reminder that evil can grow in the most unlikely places, hidden behind closed doors and protected by silence and shame. Sharon Fields lost everything: her marriage, her son, and her daughter, to secrets that festered in the darkness until they exploded into violence. But in the end, when faced with the choice between allowing another innocent person to suffer or taking justice into her own hands, she chose to protect someone she had never met from the monster her own son had become. Some might argue that Sharon should have called the police instead of taking matters into her own hands. Others believe that a mother who had already lost one child to her son's violence had every right to prevent him from claiming another victim. What cannot be argued is that when Sharon Fields walked into that church sanctuary, she ended a cycle of abuse and violence that had already claimed too many lives. Justice comes in many forms, and sometimes it arrives not through courtrooms and legal proceedings, but through the actions of someone who has lost everything and refuses to let evil continue unchecked. Sharon Fields paid a heavy price for the choices she made that Sunday morning, but she also ensured that Derek would never hurt another innocent person the way he had hurt Tiana. In a world where monsters often hide behind familiar faces and family secrets can destroy lives, sometimes justice requires ordinary people to do extraordinary things. Sharon Fields did what she felt she had to do to protect someone else's daughter from suffering the same fate as her own. And, in the end, perhaps that's the only justice that really matters. If this story moved you or made you think about the complexity of justice and family loyalty, please hit that like button and subscribe for more true crime stories that explore the darkest corners of human nature and the people who refuse to let evil go unpunished.